I'm Gillian Asquith, I'm on faculty here, and it's my delight to introduce our next speaker, who is Tony Rinaudo. So Tony served as an agriculturist missionary in Niger Republic in the 1980s and 90s, and he oversaw long-term rural development and periodic large-scale relief programs. He contributed to transforming how Nigerians farm, and for the 18 years of service that he gave to Niger Republic, the government awarded him its highest honour for an expatriate, the Order of Agriculture with Merit. Tony now serves with World Vision Australia. He's their principal climate action advisor. He promotes forestry and agroforestry initiatives globally. He's been widely recognised for his influential contribution to international awareness on the impact and efficacy of simple, low-cost, scalable methods of reforestation, known as farmer-managed natural regeneration. He has won awards for this method. Recently, he won an award for demonstrating on a large scale how dry lands can be greened at minimal cost, improving the livelihoods of millions of people. In 2019, Tony was appointed as a member of the Order of Australia. And his book that is mentioned in our programme, The Forest Underground, Hope for a Planet in Crisis, received the 2022 Christian Book of the Year Award. It's my great pleasure to welcome you, Tony.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Andrew, for the invitation. I'm very honoured, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here and share with you today. I trust that my story will be a source of hope and also inspiration for all of us to follow and act on that calling, whatever it may be, that calling that God's put into each one of our hearts. So in this passage, I think it gives a glimpse, a small idea of what emotions God was going through, where wisdom is a type or a prefigurement of Christ. In effect, Jesus was delighting in mankind. Jesus was rejoicing in his creation. The morning stars were singing with joy, and I had to Google that this morning. There are 100 million stars in the average galaxy, and they estimate there are about 2 trillion galaxies, so it must have been pretty noisy. I wonder if Adam had to put wax in his ears. All the stars were shouting for joy. And the Apostle John says there were 10,000 times 10,000 of them without their wings, if they had any, enough to fill the MCG 1,000 times. So are you getting the picture? This wasn't a genteel English garden tea party. This was an end of footy season, backslapping, foot stomping, all-out celebration of the wonders of God's creation. It was such a time of joy. When God sees the state of his creation today, how humankind is trashing it, I wonder how he feels about it. I certainly don't hear any angels singing or shouting for joy. And where are the people of God in all this? Not only are we too often silent, our lifestyle, our waste, our investments too often support this type of destruction. Where's the righteous anger and the destruction of God's creation? The 2010 Lausanne Congress on World Evangelization report says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The earth is the property of the God we claim to love and obey. We care for the earth most simply because it belongs to the one whom we call Lord." So this was my playground as a child. The trees, the hills, the mountain streams, that's where I grew up, northeast Victoria. And so it was a very happy childhood. But there were 3 things that shaped me and formed the person that I am to this day and the work that I'm so passionate about. One was that beautiful bushland that was my playground was being bulldozed. And even as a little boy, I didn't understand ecology, but there was something very wrong with that picture for the sake of short-term gain to destroy so much. And there were a lot of agricultural chemicals poisoning the water that we swam in and drank from, we fished from. And it just didn't make sense as a little boy. Secondly, I was very curious, and I was aware that while tobacco was the main crop in our valley, children just like me who, through no fault of their own, happened to be born elsewhere, were going to bed hungry. And so again, I was very angry, not just at the destruction and the injustice, but the fact that it seemed to be normal. And how could this possibly be accepted as normal? But fortunately for me, so I was angry, I was frustrated, I didn't know how to change these things. But fortunately for me, the third impact on my life was my mum, who had a very strong faith. And it gave a framework for living, that there are more important things to life than accumulating lots of money, that we are our brother's keeper. We have a duty of care for those less fortunate than ourselves, and we are to be good stewards of God's creation. Yes, use it. Yes, benefit from it, but we're to be stewards and care for it. What to do? I threw up a child's prayer simply asking God, please use me somehow, somewhere to make a difference. And I just wanted to acknowledge and pay tribute to Liz. This has been a shared vision and a shared labour of love all these years. And to be honest, without that partnership, I wouldn't be here. There'd be no story to tell today. So after university, we both studied agriculture. We joined SIM, serving in mission, and we had a placement in Niger Republic, West Africa. Borderland of the Sahara Desert, very harsh environment. There's a lot of desertification happening at that time, and one of the poorest countries in the world. And so there we were, young agricultural graduates, confronted with this landscape, which in my lifetime, I was about 24 years old then, this had been a biodiverse dryland forest with fertile farmland in the clearings, permanent springs, even wildlife, can you imagine? In just 2 short decades, it had been reduced to its knees and barely functional. So what to do? And what brought all this about? Certainly climate change was a factor, although we didn't know anything about that back then. In hindsight, today we know that all of West Africa has experienced at least a 30% reduction in average annual rainfall. It was a factor. But for what I could see living in that situation, as populations grew, there was greater demand for farmland, and much of that forest land was cleared. Well, there are consequences for that kind of destruction. Increased frequency and severity of droughts, soil surface temperatures in excess of 60 degrees Celsius at planting time. So it puts the young plants under a lot of stress and makes them more vulnerable to insect and disease attack. Wind speeds of 70 kilometres per hour that could bury or sandblast the crop, and people have to plant and replant and replant. Even in the years when we did get rain, because there was now no habitat for natural predators of pests, in those good years, and you think, yes, we'll get some food this year, there'd be an outburst of different kinds of insects, locusts, caterpillars, sap-sucking insects, you name it, we had it. Everybody was affected, but it impacted women and children more than anybody else. Water tables, which were already very deep, continued to drop. It took longer. You had to go further to collect the fuel wood to cook food if you had any. Hunger was common, and children couldn't go to school because parents couldn't afford it, but also they needed the children's labour just for survival. And there seemed to be this great contradiction, an opposite reflection of this biblical picture that we sometimes have of God's great abundance, God's great bounty, and his provision for everything that we need for life, our physical needs and for our spiritual needs. And it really puzzled me at the time. How could this be? Maybe that verse was true for Australia or in Western temperate countries, but maybe the author of the Bible forgot Niger. The longer we stayed in that country and started to understand what had been there before but had been destroyed, God had indeed provided everything that people needed for a dignified life in that country. So for me, if deforestation was one of the root causes of all these problems, then surely if we put trees back into this landscape, it would go a long way towards solving them. And when you're young, you feel invincible, you can solve any problem yesterday. It just wasn't happening. Not for lack of trying. I studied all the manuals, I consulted the experts, we experimented, seeds from outback Australia, seeds from here and there, different timing, different method. Nothing worked in a sustainable or economically viable way. 80% of the trees died. The very people who we'd come to help called me the crazy white farmer. Don't listen to him, he's mad. Who in their right mind would plant a tree of all things when they're already hungry? I need something today, not in 15, 20 years. I could understand their logic, but I realised that in that landscape with that climate, the strong winds, the high temperatures, the low soil fertility, you could not have any form of sustainable agriculture without some degree of protective cover from the trees. This was my quiet time reading one morning, and I thought there's something significant in this, but in my usual rush to get to work, I didn't reflect on it. I didn't grasp the full significance of it until later in that day. I was driving to one of the villages, and this is a fairly typical scene in that type of lateritic soil in that case. Back to the lateritic soil turns to concrete when the vegetation's removed. And I got out of the car to have a closer look in every direction, north, south, east, west, barely a tree, and I'd written it off. How many $1 million? How many decades? How many hundreds of staff to have even a small impact on that landscape? I was just about to get back into the vehicle, and I looked down at my feet. There's a little crack in the ground. It had rained the night before, and there was a plant germinating through that crack. And I remembered that verse, and I realised God's not only in the business of saving lost souls and healing broken humanity, God is equally in the business of renewing and restoring the face of the earth. And this gave me great courage, not out there alone trying to solve this thing with intellect and money and technology alone. This is God's work. And it gives us license to draw from God for wisdom, for perseverance, for inspiration. How on earth do you repair this kind of land? So all good and well, but I still didn't know what to do. And on another day, a little bit further on in my story, again, travelling to the villages, this time with a truckload of seedlings, knowing full well most of them are going to die, and feeling very, very discouraged. Would have been quite easy to give up and go home. People don't care. Everything I've tried doesn't work. What to do? Easier to just give up and go home. But I remembered that little boy's prayer, and I felt, no, God doesn't make mistakes. And it was one of those times when I really threw up a heartfelt prayer, forgive us for destroying the gift of your creation. And as a consequence of that, people are suffering. There's hunger, there's poverty. Many are fearful to get up out of bed in the morning because they don't know what disaster that day is going to bring. But I reminded God, we're your children, you still love us. Show us what to do. Open our eyes. Help us. And the amazing thing to me to this day, I'd been travelling on this bush track almost every week for 2.5 years by that stage, eyes open but totally blind to what had been there all along. And on this day, it was as if that useless-looking bush in the distance looks like a desert shrub. It seemed to be calling over to me, and I walked over to take a closer look. As soon as you look at the shape of the leaf of any plant, it's like a signature. It tells you exactly what that plant is. And in that instant, I knew that's no bush or weed, that's a tree. Everything changed. I'd been in the country long enough and travelled these bush roads enough to realise actually there are millions of these trees across that landscape. If we had special vision, we would soon realise that even if you cut the tree down, for most species, it's not the end of the tree's life. And so you've got up to 50% of the mass of the tree still alive with this enormous potential to regrow very, very quickly. And so my whole emphasis shifted from being technological and get the right biology, the right species in there. If people's false beliefs about the value of creation in general and the value of trees on their farmlands specifically, if their false beliefs led to such negative attitudes, such destructive behaviour, burning, slashing, ploughing over the top of them, grazing them, then that's where the real battle lay. And if I could just convince families and communities. Actually, it's in your best interest. You can create that future that you want for yourselves and your children by working with God's creation instead of fighting it and destroying it. If I can just win that battle, the rest is relatively easy because everything you need is literally at your feet. And so knowing what to do is one thing. Remembering these guys thought I was crazy. How do I get the message across? And I got this idea, why don't I just ask for 10 volunteers? I worked in that many villages at that time. If I could just get a volunteer from each village and invite them to come on this journey with me. I had to be honest, I thought it would work, but I wasn't 100% certain. Let's just treat it as an experiment. We'll do it on a small corner of your land, and if you like what you see after 1 year, we'll go from there. And that was the start of a revolution that spread across that country at the rate of 250,000 hectares per year for 20 years. So you can see the satellite images there on the left in the mid-70s, average tree density of about 4 trees per hectare. 20 years later, average tree density across 5 million hectares of 40 trees. 200 million trees without planting a single one. And it certainly had an environmental impact, but it also impacted people's lives. Estimates have been made that gross income of 4.5 million farmers has increased in the order of $900 million every year. So without subsidies or government enforcement or ongoing project support, every year by now working with nature instead of destroying it, gross incomes in a very, very poor country have increased that much. Every year without irrigation, without fertiliser or improved seeds, farmers in Niger are growing an additional amount of grain that's enough to feed 2.5 million people. So it had a very, very significant practical impact as well. And in 1999, we came home, I joined World Vision, and I thought, wonderful, the world's my oyster. This organisation works in 100 countries around the world. All of them are impacted by deforestation to one degree or another, and that affects livelihoods, that affects children. Let me at it. Our first big breakthrough came in Ethiopia, and in this case, not agricultural land. Again, World Vision entered this area in 1984. There was a severe drought and famine, so a lot of hunger. World Vision went in with food relief, and then a period of rehabilitation, and then 20 years of good development, schools, clinics, good farming, and so on. Despite our best efforts, every year for 20 years, we had to give some degree of food aid, sometimes more, sometimes less. And I joined in 99, and this was really puzzling. How could it be? Until I realised that we'd neglected to address one of the key underlying root causes, environmental degradation. So we took the principles of this method, regenerating trees from stumps, from seeds in the ground, and we applied it in a different context. Within 6 years, this historically food aid-dependent community sold 104 tonnes of grain to the World Food Programme. And there's a lot more story to that, but I better keep moving. And so these regions were rehydrated, more of the water soaked back into the ground, recharging wells and springs. And when you have water, the life started to flock back as well. And so I've had this wonderful privilege in my career as I've had the opportunity to spread this in many countries around the world, and then sometimes to revisit. And I see this incredible reversal. What had been a downward spiral of degradation, poverty, and despair, through now working with creation, farmers growing more and different types of crops and livestock, and farmers being more resilient. We still get climatic shocks, we still get environmental shocks, but they've diversified the farming base so that they're much more resilient, less likely to lose everything in a single year. And so it's reversed into this upward spiral of restoration, relative prosperity, and the restoration of hope. And so it's really party time. When I go back to these communities which have embraced this restoration, I see singing and dancing and clapping and shouting. Now, didn't we just have reference to that at the time of creation? I'm convinced, certainly in my experience, that when we work with God's creation instead of destroying it, we can have a foretaste of heaven on earth. And the biggest transformation, I love the green, love the trees, but the biggest transformation is this restoration of hope. And there's a real joy in that. And it often leads to opportunities to witness as well. We work in many different cultures, many different religions, but I get a strong sense that working with creation, people have a better appreciation of the Creator, and it can often provide the opportunities to come alongside people and to open the scriptures to them. So I won't go into the details of this. On the last slide, there's a QR code. There are many tangible reasons why it pays to care for God's creation. So if you want more detail, please go to that QR code that's coming up. I just wanted to share a little bit on climate change. A study was done in 10 countries fairly recently, interviewing young people, and the respondents were either 60% of the respondents were either very to extremely worried. Their emotions included sadness, they're afraid, they're anxious, they're worried. They felt powerless. And I remember that little boy growing up in Myrtleford. I just felt powerless. How do you change the adult world? But this story gives me grounds for hope. The Ethiopian project that I mentioned has been running for 18 years. In that time, it's drawn down about 300,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide, equivalent to taking, I think it was 850,000 cars off the road for a year. Now, this isn't a total solution. It's not going to make climate change go away. But imagine if we did this at scale, we could have a very, very significant impact. I get really excited about this. Many of you would have seen the Keeling curve. It plots the inexorable increase in CO2 in the atmosphere year on year. But the thing that got my attention is very strange, is this seesaw pattern. And it turns out that the peaks correspond to the northern winters when that vast arboreal forest is sleeping. So it's not drawing down any CO2, and all our emissions are adding to that peak. And the troughs in the graph correspond to the spring and summer when those trees wake up and start sucking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And this really got my juices going, because in that part of the world it's so cold. Many of those trees only work for 1 month of the year, maybe maximum 3 months, and it's so cold that what they're drawing down is coming down at a slow rate. Now, World Vision and other organisations work in countries that have arid, semi-arid, tropical and temperate climates, and we could draw down CO2 for anything from 4 months to 12 months of the year. And I thought, wow, imagine if we got together and started restoring all this degraded land. There's more than 3 billion hectares of degraded land worldwide. Imagine we could bend that Keeling curve, make life a little bit more habitable on Earth. And so I'm really thrilled to be part of World Vision, and they've gotten fully behind this because they see the link between environmental degradation, destroying God's creation, and the impact on children. And they said, let's be bold, let's restore 1 billion hectares of degraded land worldwide in the next decade. We can't do it alone, even though it's a very big organisation. We'll do it with and or through others, but let's do it. So it's very excited. And here's World Vision, the biggest NGO in the world. Not only the largest NGO, it's certainly the largest Christian NGO, taking the lead in this endeavour to restore God's creation. So for me, it's a very exciting time. I wish I was just starting my career again now, but there's lots of others coming up that are taking up the reins. So thank you.